So then, to summarize, hegemonies, in order to maintain their power, have to be the world's banker, and they have to be the world's policeman. They also have to protect not just their own raw power, they have to also protect their guiding philosophies, because countries that have oppositional philosophies to theirs can also create those kinks that we talked about in the free flow of goods and capital and so forth. And in addition to this, they have to protect against smaller countries having nationalism, because that also is going to create kinks and work against the best interests of the hegemonic power. Hegemony, therefore, carries the seeds of its own destruction. In other words, as soon as you get it, you start losing it. And you start losing it because of overextension. So, in order to have hegemony, you have to have the dominant economy. You have to have economic control, basically, of the entire world capitalist system. And that means you have to have a constant free flow of goods working to your country's advantage at all times. And if anything obstructs that anywhere in the world, you have to send your military out to that country to do something about it. However, that many military actions and wars are expensive and are ultimately a drain on your economy. So the more that happens, then the more vulnerable you are economically, the more such obstructions will pop up, the more soldiers you have to send to more places. And so you're basically spiraling. It's kind of like being on a greased pole. No matter how hard you try to climb, you were just going to start sliding downward. Here we have a 1988 quote from Henry Kissinger, who knows what he's talking about because he was Richard Nixon's Secretary of State, and it was him in 1973 that authorized the overthrow of Allende and the installation of Pinochet. He said in 1988, "Peace requires either hegemony or balance of power. We have neither the resources nor the stomach for the former. The only question is how much we have to suffer before we realize this." So, in other words, he's been reading his Wallerstein. He's saying that to maintain hegemony, to continually maintain the hegemony that the U.S. has, that it gained at the end of World War II, can't be done indefinitely because we don't have the resources. And also, he's saying, Americans don't really have the stomach for it, because to maintain that hegemony requires doing a lot of really nasty, brutal things, which is not to say that the U.S. hasn't done some nasty, brutal things even before this period. But, you know, if we were having this discussion right now in a classroom and I could look out and see you all, I know that by this point, several of you would look kind of uncomfortable, because this is difficult stuff to hear about the United States, because the ideals that the country was founded on are incompatible with all these actions, particularly when you think about the fact that these actions have required actually suppressing democratically elected governments and putting dictatorships in their place in other parts of the world so as to help the U.S. maintain its position. I think that Woodrow Wilson would be spinning in his grave if he knew about this, because, I mean, you know, he was all about interfering in other people's business, but he had this high idea of morals attached to it. This doesn't have morals attached to it. And I want you to realize, I want you to understand that all these things I've just told you about, I'm not telling you purely for the sake of being negative. And my goal isn't to say, the United States just totally sucks and is evil. That's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is these are the things that you have to do if you are going to maintain hegemony. And the alternative is to allow a balance of power, which would mean not being the main country, not being the superpower, but one power among many. And that's what happened to Great Britain. Great Britain had this huge, huge empire that spanned the entire globe. And somewhere around the middle of the 20th century, they lost almost all of it. And now, for the most part, they have a few possessions, but for the most part, they're that little island country that they were to start with. Now, they're still a major player in the world, but the British government and the British people have had to sort of face that fact that, they're not at the very top. They're not the power anymore. So another thing that's important, and the reason that, I'm spending so much time telling you about this, is like a lot of other stuff that we've discussed in this class, in order to understand what's going on, and in order to understand things that will happen, you have to understand these things. More Americans, for example, if more Americans were aware of the situation in Iran with Mossadegh in the 1950s, maybe they wouldn't be as surprised that relations with the country of Iran today are what they are. Which brings us to 9/11 and a couple of questions about it. And we're actually going to look at the second question first. And you may have never thought about this in conjunction with September 11th, 2001 before, but it will become clear. All right, second question. What happened to the Soviet Union? Well, later on in this course, we'll be talking again a lot about this, the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. There were several factors at play, and we will discuss all of them later on. But one of the big factors that brought on the fall of the Soviet Union was the Soviet invasion and attempted occupation of Afghanistan beginning in 1980 that lasted through the entire decade, pretty much, of the 1980s. And, if you're familiar with history this much, when did the Soviet Union collapse and the Cold War end? The early 90s. That is not coincidental. So the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, which, as the British could have told you, and even Alexander the Great could have told you, that's easier said than done. It's easier to come in than it is to keep it. So they came in, they invaded Afghanistan. The U.S. was opposed to this, obviously. The U.S. condemned this Soviet action. And Muslims from around the world volunteered to go and fight alongside the Afghan people, who are mostly Muslim. Mujahideen, they were called. People who are engaged in jihad, a noble struggle. So there were people coming from different parts of the Middle East, different parts of the world, who were Muslim. And they were fighting against the Soviets. The whole war in Afghanistan for the Soviet Union became sort of like their version of Vietnam. It was a quagmire, which is something that's kind of like quicksand. You get into it and you can't get out. Really easy to roll in with the tanks, but holding on to it was very, very hard. And the whole time, the United States and other Western Bloc countries, but mainly the United States, particularly the CIA, were supporting the Mujahideen and the Afghans. supporting them financially, supporting them with weapons, supporting them with training, because, my enemy's enemy is my friend, right? They're fighting against communists, so they must be the good guys. In fact, I'm sure you're familiar with Rambo, Sylvester Stallone, those movies, because they're still making them. But Rambo 3 in the late 80s saw Rambo in Afghanistan fighting alongside the Mujahideen against the Soviets. Now, who were these Mujahideen? Like I said, they were Muslim volunteers from all over the place. One of them, a guy from a wealthy and prominent family in Saudi Arabia, was named Osama bin Laden. And yes, he also benefited from equipment, training, and so forth from the CIA. Why wouldn't he? He's fighting communists. Well, as that war dragged on and on and on, and the mighty Soviet Union wasn't able to defeat this seemingly small-time country, which, if you had planned better ahead of time, you would have known. It's very mountainous, groups of tribal people who are very organized. The longer that this went on, the more it cost. The more it cost in money and in lives. And the more that happened, the more negativity toward that war there was among the citizens of the Soviet Union. And as the financial situation got worse, and at the same time there was a big increase in the arms race with the United States, so they're having to spend money on that. They were having trouble feeding their people, and this led to a lot of frustration, a lot of disaffected people in the Soviet Union, and ultimately was a big factor in the people, rising up, and not just there, but in some of the Soviet satellite states. So everything that I just discussed about hegemony applied to the Soviet Union, even though they didn't have hegemony. They were trying to. They were the number one top contender against the United States to get that hegemony. But they overextended themselves in this endless war, seemingly endless war in Afghanistan, and it ground their economy to a halt and helped lead to the collapse of the country. Okay, so bear that in mind. Where have you heard that name, Osama bin Laden? Well, he's the guy that was the mastermind of the Al-Qaeda attacks on the United States on September 11th. Okay? For various reasons, and we'll get into some of that later, but the 1990s led to the U.S. And a lot of fundamentalists in Saudi Arabia coming to sort of loggerheads. But anyway, when these attacks were carried out, you know all about this, even though most of you probably were too young to remember. Some of you may not have been born, which is a weird thought. But you know how it went down. These terrorists hijacked 3 planes, actually 4 planes, and they had 3 targets. What were their targets on that day? The World Trade Center, 2 of the planes hit there. The Pentagon, 1 of the planes crashed there. And the other target was Washington, D.C., either the White House or the Capitol. And that one didn't make it because that's the one where the passengers on the plane rose up, overpowered the hijackers, and the plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania, so it didn't reach its target. But those were the 3 targets, okay? Think about that. The World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and Washington, D.C., the Capitol or the White House. Why those 3 targets? Well, remember what hegemony is. Hegemony is having the dominant financial power in the world, the dominant military, and also the dominant political power goes along with that. And so the three targets were representatives, they were symbols of those three legs of hegemony. Those attacks that day, intended to inspire terror, hence terrorism, also were strikes against, symbolically, American hegemony, with the overall goal of doing the same thing with the United States that they had done with the Soviet Union, to basically entice the U.S. into entering a war or a series of wars that they could not ultimately win, that would drain their resources. Why could they not win? Because they weren't fighting against a specific country. They were fighting against an ideology. In essence, they were fighting against a noun, right? And how do you win a fight like that? It never ends. So the goal was to make the U.S. keep expending its resources in this endless war so that eventually it would collapse and lose that hegemony. Now, when I used to talk about this subject, say 10 years ago, I would say to students at this point, the scary part is how close they came to succeeding, right? Because indeed, the U.S. did respond not only by invading Afghanistan, but a couple of years later, by using all those events as justification to invade Iraq. A long series of wars, technically the war in Afghanistan, 19 years later, isn't really over yet. So 10 years ago, I'd say scary how close it came to succeeding. But now another 10 years have gone by, it's 2020. And looking back over the course of this century so far, I find myself wondering if maybe they didn't succeed after all. Maybe they're not in the process of succeeding still. Because what happened to the American economy? What happened to the American standing in the world? What has happened to American hegemony? It has been coming frayed. It's becoming undone. And it's all a chain of events that started on September 11th, 2001. And the psychological reaction of the U.S. government, the American people, to that day, it's kind of scary to think about. So, what happens next? Now, maybe the United States is in the process of losing that hegemony as we speak, and maybe it's not. Maybe we're going to hold on to it for a while. But we can't hold on to it forever because nobody does, and nobody can. Eventually there's going to be another shift. Now, if we follow kind of the pattern, that shift will come about because of some very disruptive thing like, a series of wars or something like that, where the U.S. gets damaged in some way and some other country winds up with the advantage. But what's going to happen? Well, as I alluded to earlier, when I talked about that quote from Kissinger, essentially, citizens of the United States are going to have to be faced with the prospect of no longer being the superpower, of no longer being the first among equals, but rather having a balance of power restored again, so that the U.S. is one of several equally powerful countries. And the fear attached to that is that once that happens, then there might be another disruption, and some other country might wind up with the hegemony. Who might it be? Maybe it'll be China. Maybe it'll be some other country that right now we're not even thinking about. But odds are very strong. It's going to happen. And we need to be thinking about that possibility and how we feel about it, and what we think is the proper way forward, really. What we think is the proper perspective of our place in the world. So I encourage you to watch the news. Watch the news closely. And from this point forward, watch it with all this stuff that we've just talked about in mind, so that you can be informed, so that you can be more aware of the reasons behind the things that are happening at any given time. And I believe that as you pay more attention, as you pay closer attention, all this stuff that I've talked about in these last couple of lectures, I believe that they will start to make more sense the more you pay attention to what's happening and the more you learn about things that have happened. And that's what history is for, right?